Hey everybody, this is a section from Marx Without Myth, a chronological study of his life and work by Maximilien Rubel and Margaret Manale. This is from part 3 of the book, which is titled 1850 to 1856. The way the book is written, each part begins with a chronology of the context of a chronology of the world in the period being discussed. So in this case, the chronology would be from 1850 to 1856, discussing world events, the context of Marx's life in this period, the socio-historical context. Then the second part of the part is a biography of Karl Marx between those years. So in this case, what I'm reading in this video is Karl Marx 1850 to 1856. So let's get busy. The chronology is going to be in a separate video. Okay, Karl Marx 1850 to 1856. First section, 1850. The first issue of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review appeared in Hamburg at the beginning of March 1850. It included a historical essay by Marx on the defeat of June 1848, in which he attempted an economic explanation of the reasons for this unsuccessful revolution. Marx intended to show that the defeats of 1848 to 49 were valuable lessons for the insurgent party and helped them mature to a, quote, truly revolutionary party. The second part of the essay, entitled June 13, 1849, appeared in the next issue of Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review and continued the analysis of the French class struggles up to June 13th. The third number of the review, published in mid-April 1850, contained the conclusion of Marx's analysis entitled The Consequences of June 13, 1849. The essence of revolutionary socialism, Marx stated, is the declaration of, quote, revolution and permanence, end quote, and the dictatorship of the proletariat is a necessary stage leading to the abolition of class differences, a precondition for the, quote, overthrow of all ideas which arise from the existing social relations, end quote. This issue included a review of current events which the authors Marx and Engels predicted, for August at the latest, of a new British trade crisis and social revolution. From the end of February throughout the month of March, Marx gave a number of lectures on political economy in his home for his friends. At this time, the Communist League, which was under Marx's leadership, decided to begin reorganizing. Together, Marx and Engels composed a circular entitled A War Plan Against Democracy, which is distributed to the League's local groups, primarily in Germany. This pamphlet analyzed summarily the unsuccessful 1848 to 49 revolutions and gave detailed directives for the coming struggle of the proletariat, whose task was far vaster than the struggle of the liberal bourgeoisie against feudal and reactionary elements. To achieve its own proper goals, the proletariat should work hand in hand with the bourgeoisie only until the latter has assumed political predominance. As soon as the bourgeoisie is in power, the working class should constitute itself as an independent political body and establish, quote, revolutionary workers' governments, end quote, parallel to the official government organs. The revolutionary government might be established in the form of city councils, clubs, or armed workers' committees, which would undermine the popular support of official institutions and set up rival candidates for the representative National Assembly. The proletariat should demand the radicalization of bourgeois reform measures. Instead of the appropriation of factories and railways, expropriation and confiscation, not proportional taxation, but progressive and heavy taxation of capital. Conditions permitting, the proletarian political organization should be open to public and should maintain a watchful and distrustful attitude towards the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels characterized the Democratic Party as, quote, far more dangerous than the earlier Liberal Party, end quote. It would continue to be powerful even among the rural proletariat as long as the proletariat in the industrial cities had not yet developed an independent political position. The tactics of the bourgeoisie consisted of bribing the working men with higher wages, attempting to destroy the revolutionary strength of the proletariat by making their present situation more tolerable. The proletariat must always remain on its guard against the ruses of the bourgeoisie. Quote, Their battle cry must be the revolution and permanence, end quote. Marx. In mid-April, Engels and Marx and August Willich, representing the League, Adam and Jules Vidal for the Blanquist and Harney for the revolutionary faction of the Chartists, met to discuss the founding of a Société Universelle des Communistes Révolutionnaires, World Society of Revolutionary Communists. The society's statutes were established and its purpose formulated as, quote, the overthrow of all privileged classes, their subjection to the dictatorship of the proletariat, under which the revolution shall be maintained sin die, until the communist society, the final organizational form of the human family, has been realized, end quote. At a summer gathering of the German Working Men's Society, Marx made the acquaintance of the German socialist Wilhelm Liebknecht, recently arrived in London after release from Swiss prison in May 1850. At about this time, he also contacted for the first time two representatives of the, quote, determined revolutionary party, end quote, of Hungary, Stefan Thür and Johann Banya. The fourth issue of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review came out about May 20th, 1850, with a number of book reviews and a monthly review of events composed by Marx and Engels jointly, commenting on the memoirs of the professional conspirator Adolphe Chenu and those of the police spy Lucien de la Hode. Marx gave a historical analysis of the functions served by secret societies in France. The Revolutionary Proletarian Party, Marx stressed, would find conspiratorial methods ill-suited for promoting its cause. Rather, the party must rely exclusively on the broad masses of working men in carrying out the modern social revolution. A second subject, which Marx wrote upon in the review, was suggested by Émile de Girardin's book Les Socialismes, les Impôts, Socialism and Taxation. He explained the communist notion of, quote, abolition of the state, end quote, is meaningful only when classes had first been abolished, and therefore a state apparatus was no longer needed to enforce the domination of one class over the others. In the review, for the months of March and April, a crisis was predicted for the immediate future in British trade and commerce and in America, accompanied by revolution of a socialist nature on the continent, where the effects of the commercial crisis would be particularly serious. In the Marx household during these months, there were also visible signs of crisis. In March 1850, the Marx household had been evicted from their flat for failing to pay the rent, had pawned the last of their furniture, and moved into a German hotel in the center of London. Jenny Marx shared her distress with her friend Josef Weidemeyer. Quote, my husband has nearly been crushed to death here with all the pettiest worries of bourgeois life, and in such an offensive way. What is more, he has needed all his energy, all his calm and level-headed self-assurance to keep his courage up during these hourly and daily struggles, ... I'm asking you to send, please, as soon as possible, any money that has been or will be received from the sale of the review. We need it very, very much, end quote. Jenny Marx, May 20th, 1850. The proceeds from the review enabled Marx to move his family into a two-room flat in Dean Street, Soho, in May. Here, Marx was able to continue throughout the summer months the lecture series on political economy, which he had begun in February. In June, Marx's request for admittance to the reading room of the British Museum Library was granted, and there he began an intensive study of the past decade of economic history. A particular help to him was the London journal The Economist. The second bulletin of the League's Central Committee went out to the member groups in June. It reported in England and warned the members to be wary of the secret refugee organizations under the leadership of petite bourgeois elements. The authorship of this circular is uncertain. In a letter to the Frankfurt Neue Deutsche Zeitung, Marx replied to a critique of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review, explaining that the review advocated not only, quote, the rule and dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, but also the, quote, abolition of all class differences whatsoever, end quote. Marx. Conflicts with the Central Committee finally led to an open split between the Willich faction and the supporters of Marx and Engels on September 15, 1850. The League's ties with the German Working Men's Society were dissolved and the seat of the Central Committee transferred to Cologne. The two dissident factions were established as independent communist groups within the League. Marx and other members of his faction soon withdrew from the Working Men's Society and the Refugee Committee. In autumn, Marx resumed work on the volume of Political Economy while reading on money and finance at the British Museum. He also continued reading and taking notes on recent economic history. Towards the end of the year, he corresponded with Hermann Becker in Cologne, who was interested in publishing his collected essays. A first section of the text was set during December. In November, George Harney's Red Republican published the first English translation by Helen Macfarlane of the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels were named as the authors. Sorry. I'm feeling allergenic. Plagued by debts and gravely worried about his family's immediate future, Marx requested Wedemeyer in Frankfurt to redeem his wife's silver from a local pawnbroker and sell them in order to surmount the crisis. October 29, 1850. On November 19, 1850, Marx's younger son Guido died suddenly of a convulsive fit. At this time, Engels left London for Manchester to assume the position in his father's spinning mill, which he was to retain until 1869. The final issue of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung Review appeared on November 29th. It included Engels, the Peasant War in Germany, and a lengthy review of the monthly events of May to October, written by the two friends in collaboration. There was also a detailed analysis of the past decade of economic history and a prognosis of social developments based on Marx's recent study of economic trends. The review concluded that a genuine revolution was impossible in times of prosperity and would be provoked only by a new economic crisis. Crisis and then revolution were both seen to be inevitable. New section, 1851. Apart from attendance at meetings of the London Council of the Communist League, Marx devoted himself intensively to his studies in economic history and theory at the British Museum. During the year, he filled about 14 notebooks with excerpts from the authors he read. In the following, the subjects are broken down by month. January, ground rent. In a letter to Engels, Marx gave a detailed critique of Ricardo's rent theory on January 7, 1851, emphasizing how modern technology had changed land fertility and made obsolete Malthus's theory of the declining rentability of land. He noted that the so-called, quote, laws governing land rent are merely laws of bourgeois competition based on the interplay of prices on the capitalist market. Money and currency circulation, Bailey, Carey, and Jacob. The results of Marx's investigations are summarized in a letter to Engels on February 30, 1851, where he denied the validity of the classical theory that the flux of precious metals determines the trade balance and exchange rates on the world money market. February to March 1851, Money and Currency, Gray, Smith, Bosanquet, Torrens, Hume, and Locke. April to May 1851, Money, Torrens, Sarah, General Economic Theory, Ricardo, Land Fertility. Marx became interested in the problem of fertility in agriculture after reading an article in The Economist which reported the successful use of electricity for increasing land productivity. Marx discussed the problem in his correspondence with Engels and Roland Daniels. May 1851, Wages, Carey, Population Problems, Malthus. June 1851, Theory of Value and Wealth, Torrens, Carey, Malthus. July 1851, Labor Problems, the Factory System and Agriculture. Marx read the English socialist Owen, Hodgkin, Fielden, Hopkins on the labor situation in Britain, reread Malthus on population, and took up several authors on agriculture and agrochemistry. August 1851, Population and Agriculture, Thornton Johnson, Colonization and Slavery, Prescott Howitt. Marx also read Proudhon's recent publication, The General Idea of Revolution in the 19th Century, whose content he recounted in a letter to Engels. Both men agreed that the book was considerably better than Proudhon's earlier writings, but criticized his reform proposals as too limited. Quote, the more I get into this stuff, the more I am convinced that agricultural reform, and therefore the dirty property business which is based on it, will be the essence of the coming revolution, end quote. Marx wrote to Engels, August 14, 1851. Political Economy of the Ancient Romans, 2 volumes by Duroux de la Malle. September 1851, Sketches of the Coming War by Gustav Adolf Chekhov. Marx is discovered his political manifesto through a book review in the New Yorker Staatszeitung. Chekhov presented his reflections on the unsuccessful revolutions of 1848 to 49 and predicted that the coming revolution would be waged in Germany and Italy as a European war staged by the military and would be neither a class struggle nor the result of a civil war, as Marx predicted. September to October 1851, Banking, Agronomy, and Technological History. November 1851, Gratuité du Crédit by Proudhon to Engels, quote, "This surpasses in charlatanry, blustering, bragging, and deficiency all the fellow's previous achievements," end quote. Marx, November 24th, 1851. In this year, we see Engels assume what was to become his perennial role as financial and moral supporter of the Marx family and as the goad stimulating his friend to, quote, "finish with the, quote, economics," end quote, end quote. On January 8th, 1851, he sent Marx £1 to pay the overdue rent. Towards the end of February, a serious dispute arose within the ranks of the London emigrants because of George Harney's relationship with the Willich shopper faction, now estranged from the group around Marx and Engels. Harney had been helping promote among the Chartists and other liberal organizations an international banquet planned by the Willich shopper group in commemoration of the February Revolution. When Marx and his friends officially boycotted the banquet, they nevertheless sent two of their number as unofficial observers. Recognized as members of the rival group, two were beaten up and thrown out of the hall, while Harney, who also recognized them as friends of his own, remained silent. Following this episode, the relations between Harney and Marx and Engels cooled considerably, and Engels withdrew his manuscript submitted for publication in Harney's The Friend of the People. In a letter to Engels on the 1st of April, 1851, Marx established that in about 5 weeks he would be able to start writing his, quote, economics, which he now planned to publish in 3 volumes. He wrote to several friends in Germany, asking for their aid in finding a publisher. Desperate for money, Marx drew a bill on his mother in Trier during March, causing a heated dispute with her over Marx's financial situation. In the midst of this trouble, Franziska Marx was born on March 28, 1851. Shortly thereafter, Engels sent his friend an amount sufficient to cover their most urgent expenses. Up to his ears in, quote, petit bourgeois muck, end quote, Marx also wrote to Engels about a certain, quote, mystère, in which the latter was to play a role as well, and promised to explain this affair in a subsequent letter, March 31st, 1851. On April 2nd, however, Marx informed his friend that he had decided to make the trip to Manchester at the end of the month to explain this, quote, mystère, tête-à-tête, or tête-à-tête, I don't know. Marx was in Manchester from April 20th to 26th, 1851. Ferdinand Lassalle, who had been recently released from prison after serving a sentence for his political activities, made several vain attempts to regain the confidence of the Cologne communists and to be admitted to their ranks. Daniels wrote to warn Marx of Lassalle's pose of friendship, April 12, 1851, and characterized Lassalle as a, quote, superficial joker and a genuine democratic charlatan, end quote, April 24, 1851. On May 12, 1851, Lassalle wrote to Marx personally, announcing that he had recommenced his studies of economics and was burning with interest and impatience to read Marx's Political Economy. Quote, the 3-volume monster of Ricardo turned socialist and Hegel turned Ricardo turned socialist and Hegel turned economist, end quote. Lassalle. At the end of April 1851, Marx was informed that the first and only installment of his collected essays, published by Becker, had appeared in Cologne. This pamphlet of 5 printer sheets, 16 pages to a sheet, contained a selection of articles he had written as a liberal journalist in Germany. Becker had issued a prospectus announcing that Marx's essays will be published in 2 volumes of 25 printer sheets. However, a series of arrests in Germany put an abrupt end to this project. On the 10th of May, a number of Cologne a member of the Cologne League, was arrested in Leipzig, and this was followed by the arrest of Becker and Peter Reuser in Cologne and Heinrich Burgers in Dresden. Marx asked Lassalle to help him find a new publisher in Dusseldorf. Lassalle reported on June 26 that his efforts had proved unsuccessful. On the 18th of May, 1851, Marx attended a lecture held by Robert Owen on the occasion of his 80th birthday. During the course of the evening, he was drawn into an unavoidable conversation with George Harney, the first since the episode in February 1851. An event occurred on June 23, 1851, in the Marx residence, which had been interpreted as the solution to the mystère mentioned in March and April. Helena de Muth gave birth to a son, Frederick Louis de Muth, whose paternity was not recorded on the birth certificate. The baby was not retained by its mother, but quickly removed from the household in Dean Street. Expenses for its lodging and later schooling were assumed by Engels. Letters and documents, first published in 1862, reveal that the child's father was Marx, and that Engels had confessed to this fact to Eleanor Marx, the youngest of Marx's children, in 1895, shortly before his death. Following this event, the Marx family seemed to have been in quite some uproar. Marx described the state of affairs to Engels in a letter of July 31st. Quote, "For about the past fortnight now, I have written absolutely nothing. For when I am not at the library, I am hunted like a dog, and therefore, despite the best of intentions, I am constantly interrupted in my work, ... At home, disruptions and disturbances are too much for me. Everything is constantly in a state of siege, and the streams of tears for nights on end try my nerves and drive me mad. Naturally, I cannot do much. I feel sorry for my wife. She has the heaviest load to bear, and au fond, she is right. Industry ought to be more productive than marriage." End quote. Marx, July 31st, 1851. That's interesting, because a lot of people tried to deny that Marx was the father of this child. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm looking forward to the completion of Michael Heinrich's biography of Marx, to see what he says on the matter of Marx having a, quote, illegitimate son with Helena Demuth. Documents found on the person of the arrested members of the League were published in a number of German newspapers at the end of June 1851. They included the League's statutes and the 1850 address written by Marx and Engels, which, being, quote, au fond, nothing more than a war plan against democracy, end quote, not only brought a certain notoriety to Marx's ideas, but also damaged the case of the arrested communists. Marx to Engels, July 13th, 1851. Marx, who was now deeply in debt and without a source of income, was forced to accept the generous support of his friends in order to feed and lodge his family and himself. On August 5th, however, he received an offer from the New York publisher Charles Dana, inviting his contributions to the New York Daily Tribune. The first articles which Dana published under Marx's name were actually written by Engels in English. 18th in all. These articles appeared from October 1851 to October 1852 under the title Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Upon the recommendation of Ferdinand Freiligrath, Marx sent Hermann Ebner in Frankfurt a plan of his, quote, economics, hoping that he would be able to find a publisher for it. At this time, Ebner was actually a secret agent of the Austrian police. Marx also studied a publisher for a pamphlet against Proudhon's Idée Générale, and wrote to the Hoffman and Kampa in Hamburg on August 20th, 1851. Their reply was negative. Freiligrath also reported on September 25th, 1851, that his efforts to find a publisher through Ebner had failed. Wilhelm Pieper in Cologne announced that he too had any disappointing news to report. Lassalle then came up with a plan to form a publishing house on a joint stock basis, which would bring out Marx's, quote, economics. Marx turned this plan down, fearing that financial backing would not be forthcoming from the bourgeoisie because of the political situation, and that, were his present financial state to become public, his position would be compromised. Members of the Willich Schopper faction were arrested in Paris in September 1851. Documents found in their possession were falsely attributed to Marx, as the German press began a vicious campaign against him. Marx disavowed authorship of the documents in question in declarations which appeared in October 1851 in 2 German papers. In November, Marx spent 10 days in Manchester with Engels. The major topic of the discussion was the plan for Marx's, quote, economics. The 3 volumes were to contain 1. A critique of political economy, 2. A critique of the socialists, and 3. The history of political economy. See letter to Engels, November 27, 1851. On September 29, 1851, Josef Weidemeyer, one of Marx's and Engels' closest friends and former editor of the Neue Deutsche Zeitung, left Frankfurt to settle in America, where he planned to publish a news weekly entitled Die Revolution. De-revolution, I guess is how you say it. I don't know how to say words like revolution or solution or things like that, or those kind of words in German. De-revolution. Marx's first contribution to this journal was to be a historical critical study of the provocative title, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. In mid-December, Marx set to work on this sardonic critique of Napoleon III, proposing to Weidemeyer at the same time a second article on Proudhon's Idées Générales. His work, however, did not advance as quickly as expected, and the Brumaire was delayed, quote, not only through the precipitous course of current events, but to an even greater extent through personal circumstances, end quote. Marx to Weidemeyer, January 1st, 1852. Marx had scarcely finished the first installment of his article for Weidemeyer when illness interrupted his writing for most of the month of January 1852. Jenny Marx, meanwhile, took over her husband's correspondence and sent Weidemeyer the second part of the article on January 8, 1852. In Marx's name, she was also asked Weidemeyer to break the, quote, conspiracy of silence in the press against the imprisoned Cologne communists. Quote, these people are laughing in the prisons, are being terribly not laughing, Jesus Christ. Quote, these people are languishing in the prisons, are being terribly mistreated, and now have to stay there another 3 months, while the great men of the future are pocketing thousands in the name of the revolution and are already distributing among themselves the posts in the government to come, end quote. Jenny Marx. In Marx's name. In early February 1852, Marx was visited for the first time by the Hungarian officer János Banya, who was, unknown to Marx, a secret police agent and emissary of Louis Kossuth. He provided Marx with information on the relations between the various rival revolutionary leaders and national heroes. Attracted by Banya's offer of £25 in payment, Marx accepted the proposal to write a pamphlet containing character sketches of prominent members of the German immigration and exile. However, before giving his definitive answer on the project, Marx asked Engels for an opinion, April 30th, 1852. Engels replied that he had already been putting together files of such material in order to have information at hand, quote, when things start popping, end quote, and advised Marx to accept. May 1st, 1852. Marx was indeed sorely in need of the £25, for he again found himself in serious financial difficulty. This man, whom Hermann Everbeck characterized as a critical genius of a rank no less than Lessing, was now hardly able to concentrate on his writing projects. In February 1852, the family situation was so critical that Marx had pawned his overcoat and was consequently unable to leave the house and had lost his credit at the butcher's. Despite small sums from friends and the proceeds from the first New York Daily Tribune articles, their misery grew until on the 14th of April, the youngest child, Francisca, died of bronchitis. They were forced to borrow money from their French neighbors in order to pay for the little girl's coffin and her burial. Jenny Marx later wrote, quote, she had no cradle when she came into the world, and for a long time was refused a last resting place. With what heavy hearts we saw her carried to her grave, end quote. Jenny Marx. Reminiscence of Marx and Engels. Since Banya had insisted that the pamphlet was urgent and that payment would be made on delivery, Marx clearly set to work, together with Ernst Dronke, to draft a text which he intended to revise with Engels' aid. About May 25, 1852, he went to Manchester, when he and Engels spent about a month revising the manuscript, which he sent to Banya at the end of June. The expected payment did not arrive on time, however, nor was there a sign of the published text. Not till the end of the year did Marx learn from Gustav Zerfi that Banya was a secret agent for the police of several European countries. Gustav Zerfi disclosed that Banya had probably returned Marx's manuscript over to the Prussian police lieutenant Grief, with whom he was in regular contact. Marx decided not to expose Banya until he had had the opportunity to look for a publisher for his pamphlet entitled Great Men of Exile. The objects of Marx's critique and biting sarcasm included Gottfried Kinkel, August Willich, Gustav Struve, Arnold Ruge, Karl Heinzen, and Harro Haring, whose quarrels and differences gave ample material for a lively picture of the German immigration since 1848.
Meanwhile, in New York, Wedemeyer was having difficulty financing his journal and wrote to Marx that he was not certain to be able to publish the 18th Brumaire. As Marx finished writing the sections of this manuscript, he sent them off to New York. With the March 5th delivery, he enclosed a letter which summarized the difference between his approach to economic theory and the theories of the other socialist and bourgeois economists. Quote, "As for me, I cannot claim the honor of having discovered either the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle of these classes among themselves. Long before me, bourgeois historiographers had shown the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists have traced out the economic structure of this very struggle. The novelty of what I have done is to prove simply that the existence of classes with certain historic phases, of the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily culminates in the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship is itself only a transitional form leading to the abolition of all classes, and a classless society," end quote. Marx. March 5th, 1852. The final installment of the 18th Brumaire was sent off on March 25th, 1852. Not until 2 months later did the work appear as the first issue of Wedemeyer's new review, Die Revolution. Thanks to the financial assistance received from a German immigrant in America, a mixture of history, sociology, and political pamphleteering. The 18th Brumaire retraced the chain of events from 1848 to the coup d'etat of 1851 as France regressed from a bourgeois republic to a Praetorian regime dominated by the histrionic autocrat Louis Napoleon. Frightened by the prospect of social revolution, the propertied classes had preferred to abandon their political power to a man who seemed capable of turning back the clock of history and helping them retain their dominant social position. For Marx, this relapse into an earlier form of state power showed that the social republic in France was still a utopia and that there was not yet any real participation by the proletariat in the governing process. The real social revolution to come, quote, cannot draw its poetry from the past but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has shed all superstitious belief in the past. Earlier revolutions needed reminiscences of history in order to deceive themselves as to their own significance. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury the dead if it wants to arrive at its own proper destiny," end quote. Marx, 1852. Marx found that the authoritarian regime of Louis Napoleon was most popular among the small-holding peasants. Parcellenbauern, who, as Marx remarked in passing, actually formed no real social class at all. Each being self-sufficient and independent of his neighbors, these peasants had, quote, no sense of community, no national ties, and no political organization among themselves, end quote. Marx. However, Bonaparte's state organization was preparing its own inevitable demise through the growing state centralization which turned the governing apparatus into a nearly autonomous force, existing side by side with the social classes. The task of the coming proletarian revolution, which would make allies of the small-holding peasants and the industrial proletariat, would thus be to destroy the state machinery while conserving the advantages of centralization. Quote, bureaucracy is only the vulgar and brutal form of centralization still afflicted with its opposite, with feudalism. When he loses faith in the Napoleonic Restoration, the French peasant will abandon faith in his own small holding, and the proletarian revolution will then obtain its chorus, for want of which its solo song becomes a swan song in all peasant nations. End quote. Marx. Although Marx did not return to his readings on economics until July, Marx had made numerous efforts in the meantime to find a publisher for his projected work. The publisher Vegand in Leipzig turned down the offer, quote, on account of the risk to which one would be exposed in view of the state, end quote, should he venture to publish Marx. See Vegand to Marx, March 20th, 1852. Ebner and Frankfurt also reported negative results in the search for a publisher. Ebner to Engels, July 19th. In July and August, Marx then began his studies afresh with works on cultural history, the history of woman, Volksmut, of feudalism, and literature in general. He was also interested in a number of works by and about Giordano Bruno. During the summer, Marx began writing his own articles for the New York Daily Tribune, with Engels providing the translations into English. The first, entitled, quote, The Elections, Tories and Whigs, end quote, appeared on August 26 and was followed by 6 others. On the Chartists, British political institutions, and electoral corruption, all translated by Engels and published between August and November 1852. For one article on the movement of titled Movements of Mazzini and Kossuth, League with Louis Napoleon, end quote, October 19, 1852. Marx used information furnished by Bagna on the secret ambition of Kossuth and his accomplice Mazzini to win the tyrant Napoleon for an alliance with revolutionary Hungary, a goal which could only discredit the revolutionaries in the eyes of their people. One of Marx's articles on the Disraeli budget was translated by Pieper and appeared in the New York Daily Tribune on December 25th, 1852. Sorry for all this hacking and wheezing and snorting and all that, but I had COVID last week and I'm testing negative, but I still have a lot of snortiness. Okay, where am I? Constantly penniless, increasingly indebted to the landlord and the neighborhood shopkeepers, Marx tried to find new sources of income through translations of earlier publications and contracts for articles. He proposed to the publisher Brockhaus an article to be based on his readings at the British Museum, dealing with, quote, modern literature on political economy in England 1830 to 1852, unquote, for the Brockhaus periodical Die Gegenwart. Here Marx intended to treat 1. General works on political economy, 2. Writing on specialized topics such as population problems, colonization, banking, protective tariffs, free trade, etc. The proposal was declined on the 27th of August, 1852. Efforts to bring out an English edition of the 18th Brumaire or to publish it in Germany were likewise fruitless. As Stefan Naut wrote to Marx on September 14th, 1852, quote, the name alone, bracket, Marx, end bracket, suffices to bring a mass of unpleasantries down on one's head, end quote. Stefan Naut. In September, with 3 members of the family ill, Marx lacked money to pay the doctor to buy the English dailies, which he used in writing correspondence reports for the Daily Tribune. Engels and Freiligrath helped him over this crisis. After numerous delays, the trial of the Cologne communists began on the 4th of October, 1852. Marx sent a detailed letter for the defense of the accused to their attorney, Karl Schneider, in Cologne, October 14, 1852. Determined to bring this trial to the attention of the public, Marx wrote a pamphlet and called upon Engels to help find the funds for that pamphlet's publication. This pamphlet, Marx wrote Engels, quote, is not a vindication of principles, but a denunciation of the Russian government, based on the presentation of facts and the course of events, end quote. Marx, October 27, 1852. Judgment in the case was delivered on November 12, 1852. 7 of the accused were sentenced, 4 acquitted. Marx finished his pamphlet on December 2, 1852, and sent it off to Schnabelitz in Basel and to Adolf Kluss in Washington, who had both agreed to publish it. At a meeting of the League on November 17th, Marx moved that the group be disbanded and declared that since the arrest in Cologne, its existence was no longer in keeping with the times. The motion was passed. Marx to Engels, November 19th, 1852. Through Kluss in America, Marx received a letter from someone claiming to be Kossuth's secretary in reply to Marx's 2 Daily Tribune articles in the Hungarian Leader. Marx wrote to Kossuth personally and learned that in fact he had no American secretary and was further grateful to Marx for the warnings about Louis Napoleon. Kossuth's statement appeared in the Daily Tribune on January 4, 1853. On December 30th, Zmera, another of the Hungarian immigrants, wrote to Marx to warn him about the informant Zerfi, who was reputed to be, quote, good at best as a source of information about the enemy's camp, end quote. New section, 1853. The, quote, sleepless night in exile, end quote, had begun for the Marx family in London. In the previous 3 years, the family's situation, both financial and social, had grown even more precarious than on the continent, and Marx's reputation as a writer, scholar, and activist had, if anything, diminished. While the interest in his writings and studies remained limited to a small circle of loyal adherents, following the trial in Cologne, he was branded as the head of an international conspiratorial organization, the, quote, Marx Party, end quote, whose goal was said to be the overthrow of the Prussian monarchy. The worst fears of the German publishers, who had not dared accept his writings for publication, were realized. Although he had expected to be far enough advanced in his studies to begin writing the, quote, economics in the spring of 1851, Marx did not resume his reading until this year. Yet instead of starting to put his own thoughts on paper, he continued making extracts from the authors he was reading, as if his research were still far from being finished. He began with works by Opdyke, Banfield, and Herbert Spencer on social and industrial organization, but was soon forced to abandon his reading again. Because of illness and need to transport his family by writing articles for the Daily Tribune, Marx did not take up his private studies again until 1856. It was not long before he began writing his Daily Tribune articles directly in English, choosing topics of current economic or political interest which provided him with material for brief social or historical critiques. The documentation thus furnished a vivid illustration of his theoretical viewpoint. In discerning the profit drive, the hunger for power within the dominant classes of Victorian England and continental Europe, Marx exposed the hidden forces behind the contemporary course of events. Along with several articles on the recent British elections, the Daily Tribune published a contribution by Marx on, quote, the Duchess of Sutherland and slavery, end quote, which reported on a protest addressed sent by a group of aristocratic Englishwomen to their American sisters. The president of the protesting group was none other than the Duchess of Sutherland. His family had made its fortune by driving Scottish peasants from their lands and appropriating them as grazing pastures for Sutherland sheep. Marx concluded, therefore, that, quote, the enemy of British wage slavery has the right to condemn Negro slavery. A Duchess of Sutherland, however, a Duke of Athol, a Manchester cotton lord, never, exclamation point, end quote. Marx, February 9th, 1853. Marx wrote his first article in English on the subject of, quote, capital punishment, in reply to another article in the London Times. He condemned this, quote, hangman's apotheosis, end quote, praised by the Times, and showed that the argument of its deterrent effect was untenable from both a moral and an empirical standpoint. Quote, It would be very difficult, if not altogether impossible, to establish any principle upon which the justice or expediency of capital punishment could be founded in a society glorying in its civilization, end quote. Marx, February 9th, 1853. Hegel had once given a systematic theory of punishment, Marx noted, and had maintained that, quote, punishment is the right of the criminal, is an act of his own will, end quote. That the criminal's negation of right is negated to give an ultimate confirmation of right. For Marx, however, Hegel's dialectic was, quote, only a metaphysic expression for the old, quote, jus talionis, end quote, end quote. In other words, the law of vengeance. Other important topics which Marx dealt with in the first part of the year, 1853, included the Milan Uprising, quote, symbol of the approaching revolutionary crisis on the entire European continent, end quote, Marx, March 8, 1853, as well as the Turkish question. It had been arranged that the Neue England Zeitung in Boston was to publish Marx's Revelations on the Communist Trial in Cologne in installments, March to April 1853, while Schnabelitz in Basel would print it in pamphlet form for subsequent distribution in Germany, January 1853. In the Revelations, Marx narrated the, quote, repugnant comedy of lackeys and police agents, end quote, staged by the Prussian government using its own secret agents and aided by the French police together with other corruptible elements. Mounted in order to put the Cologne communists who entertained relations with Marx behind bars, this spectacle depicted the latter as the head of an international organization of conspirators, plotting to overthrow the Prussian government. Since the documents found in the possession of the accused, such as the Communist Manifesto, did not provide adequate proof that the accused had actually established a program of revolutionary action, the Prussian government, assisted by the Prussian government's agents and, quote, hired hands, end quote, in France and England, resorted to the manufacture of the missing pieces, to forgery and to perjury so that the, quote, facts, end quote, would coincide with the indictment. The infamy did not stop there, however. They had even attempted to buy a false witness. With this magnificent production, the Prussian government had risked its own international reputation, imagining itself forced to abuse all the laws of the criminal code in order to defeat this small but treacherous party of conspirators. The issue at stake was not, therefore, the guilt or innocence of the accused, but their guilt or the guilt of the Prussian government. The verdict of guilty was duly pronounced against the 7 members of the League. In recapitulating the complicated story of this piece of Prussian justice, Marx had intended to enlighten the German public about the numerous scenes of the drama which had been played, as it were, in the wings. Publication of the document did not, however, assure that it would actually reach its audience. Schnabelitz's stock of 2,000 copies was seized by the German police while being smuggled across the Swiss border into Germany, March 7, 1852. As Jenny Marx wrote to Kluss, quote, at the moment the pamphlet would have had the most colossal effect. It would have struck like a thunderbolt amidst the trembling, shaking police people, ... You can imagine what an effect this news has had on my husband's health, etc., end quote. Jenny Marx, March 10th, 1853. Marx's first bout with hepatitis dated from this episode. Apart from the anger and frustrations related to the trial and the publication of his pamphlet, he was again without income or other means of support for his family. While I tried vainly to find a publisher for the manuscript of Great Men of Exile, Jenny wrote to all their friends and relatives, quote, terrible letters, end quote, in which she was obliged to beg for aid for her hungry family. See Jenny Marx to Engels, April 27, 1853. For the April issues of the Daily Tribune, Marx reported on Mazzini, O'Connor, and the affairs of the British government. He also wrote 3 articles for Jones' People's Paper based on his Daily Tribune reports and dealing with Gladstone's fiscal policies. In May, he began investigating the question of British influence and hegemony in the East in preparation for his articles on British rule in India and China. He made numerous excerpts from authors such as Thomas Raffles, Washington Wilkes, George Campbell, R.P. Patton, David Urquhart, and examined numerous documents on British diplomatic relations with India, in particular the publication of the India Reform Association and Urquhart's portfolio. Between June and October 1853, 11 articles by Marx on India, British rule in the East India Company appeared in the Daily Tribune. On June 14, 1853, Marx's article on, quote, revolution in China and Europe, end quote, was published as well. Here he recapitulated the recent history of Western, and especially British, trade with the East, calling attention to the social changes wrought by the influx of foreign commercial goods. The patriarchal authority of the Chinese emperor was being undermined, the population unsettled through the abundance of inexpensive British textiles and the growing use of opium. Eastern isolation was brought to an end as industrialization drove the West to seek new and unexplored markets. Quote, now, England having brought about the revolution of China, the question is how that revolution will in time rest on England and through England on Europe. ... It may safely be augured that the Chinese Revolution will throw the spark into the overloaded mine of the present industrial system and cause the explosion of the long-prepared general crisis, which, spreading abroad, will be closely followed by political revolutions on the continent. End quote. Marx, June 14th, 1853. Marx's studies on the developmental history of Eastern society led Marx to conclude that, quote, ... Bernier rightly considers the basis of all phenomena in the East. He refers to Turkey, Persia, Hindustan, to be the absence of any private property whatsoever in land. This is the real key, even to the Oriental heaven, ... End quote. Letter to Engels, June 2nd, 1853. As for India, Marx maintained that the incursion of the British bourgeoisie had, as such, no effect of a socio-revolutionary nature and explained the, quote, stationary character, end quote, of the East is due to, quote, 1. The public works which are the affair of the central government. 2. Besides this, the whole empire except for the few larger cities is divided up into villages, each having an entirely distinct organization and forming a little world in itself, end quote. Marx, June 14, 1853. From June to September, Marx continued his correspondence reports on the growing conflict between Russia and Turkey, the Irish question, parliamentary affairs in Britain and the crisis, symptoms, war, strikes, price increases, etc. In an article on the, quote, Russian question of August 12, 1853, Marx reviewed Russia's historical role as aggressor in Central Europe, noting the consistency of the goals pursued by the Tsars. He attributed this aggression to Russia's geographical circumstances and the need for access to seaports in order to maintain her influence in Europe, as well as to her traditions. Quote, if the success of her hereditary policy proves the weakness of the Western powers, the stereotyped mannerism of that policy proves the intrinsic barbarism of Russia herself, end quote. While the cunning of Russian politics succeeded in impressing the courts of Europe, Marx believed that Russia would prove herself, quote, utterly powerless with the revolutionized peoples, end quote. The approaching social revolution, which will overthrow the domination of the Christian Rome of the West, will also prove to be the, quote, real antagonist, end quote, of Russian tyranny and put an end to the demoniac influence of Constantinople, the Eastern Rome at stake in the present conflict between Russia and the West. In another article from June 14, 1853, Marx had also warned about the Russian tactics of expansion in Europe using religious pretexts and summed up the account of its territorial gains as protector of Orthodox Christianity. Quote, the total acquisition of Russia during the last 60 years are equal, the total acquisitions, plural, of Russia during the last 60 years are equal in extent and importance to the whole empire she had possessed in Europe before that time, end quote. British aggression in the East, on the other hand, achieved a double purpose. First, in destroying the old primitive society, and secondly, in constructing a modern industrialized Indian nation. With the introduction of the railway system in the East, the British paved the way for modern industry and the development of the country's productive power. Moreover, this step put an end to the isolated craftsmen's enterprises and dissolved the, quote, hereditary divisions of labor upon which rest the Indian caste, those decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power, end quote. August 8th, 1853. In India as elsewhere, the bourgeoisie of industrialized Europe was fulfilling its historic task of developing the material basis upon which a new social order might be founded. Quote, bourgeois industry and commerce create these material conditions in the same way as geological revolutions have created the surface of the earth, end quote. In the London Morning Advertiser, the Russian immigrants Ivan Golovin and Alexander Herzen attacked Marx for having supposedly written a defamatory article against their countryman Bakunin on August 23rd in the same journal. Marx's reply, published on September 2nd, 1853, refuted this assumption and declared his solidarity with Bakunin's activity in past revolutionary efforts. Although he continued his regular contributions to the Daily Tribune, Marx still found himself in financial distress and was aided by occasional £1 or £5 notes from Engels. From time to time he contributed as well to the People's Paper, yet, as he confessed to Kluss, quote, "This continual journalistic hackwork is getting on my nerves. It takes up a lot of time, destroys any continuity in my efforts, and in the final analysis really amounts to nothing at all. You can be as independent as you please. Nevertheless, you are tied to the paper and to the readers, especially when you are paid in cash as I am. Purely scientific endeavors are something totally different." Marx, end quote. Marx, September 5th, 1853. Marx continued to follow the events of the Turkish conflict until the end of the year, with about 16 articles published beginning in September. He also treated British economic and political affairs, Peel's Bank Act of 1844, strikes, the misery of Britain's industrial workers, and wrote a series of articles on Lord Palmerston, published in full in the People's Paper and in abridged form in the Daily Tribune. The London publisher E. Tucker brought out one of these articles on, quote, "Palmerston in Russia," end quote, as a fly sheet in a printing of 15,000 copies. This publication soon proved to be Marx's greatest literary success. Although the first edition was out of print within a few weeks, Marx himself realized no financial gain from the enterprise. The articles on Lord Palmerston were written in the same satirical tone which characterizes polemics against Bruno Bauer and his followers. Marx attacked both the personality and the politics of the renowned British statesman, whom he depicted as a man of neither profound ideas nor high objectives, but rather as one who, quote, "exalts in show conflicts, show battles, show enemies, ... in violent parliamentary debates, which are sure to prepare him an ephemeral success, the constant and the only object of all his exertions," end quote. Marx Engels, On Britain, page 394, 1853. Submissive to foreign influence indeed, if not in word, Lord Palmerston helped Europe's tyrants to consolidate their power, while declaring himself the champion of constitutional freedom and democracy. In Marx's eyes, his greatest shortcoming was to be extremely credulous in his dealings with the Russians, thereby helping them to achieve dominance over the Danube shipping routes. Quote, "There's no such word in the Russian vocabulary as, quote, honor. As to the thing itself, it is considered to be a French delusion. ... For the inventions of Russian honor, the world is exclusively indebted to my Lord Palmerston, who, during a quarter of a century, used at every critical moment to pledge himself in the most emphatic manner for the, quote, honor of the Tsar," end quote. It says Hutchinson, page 209. Is that Hutchinson or is it Marx? I don't know. Thus the vaunted merits and services of Palmerston to the world and to his people were in fact but the pose of an aristocratic, quote, agent of Russian absolutism. Marx's Revelations, which had appeared in America only, provoked an attack by August Willich, who also conducted in the German-American press. Kluss in Washington sent Marx copies of Willich's articles, published during October and November 1853 in the Belletristisches Journal und New Yorker Kriminalzeitung. Willich had inspired earlier in the year, April 1853, a series of articles against Marx by Wilhelm Hirsch, who revealed Marx's relations with the spy Banya in an attempt to discredit him among the revolutionary and proletarian groups. Marx decided to prepare a rejoinder to Willich's remarks and wrote during November a pamphlet ironically entitled "The Night of the Noble Consciousness," which he sent to Kluss on the 29th for publication in America. New section, 1845. Says, see it, this is a typo. It says 1845, but it means 1854. '54. Willich's attack on Marx had been motivated by the feeling that Marx had wrongfully insulted and betrayed both him and his faction in the Communist League with his, quote, revelations. He accused Marx of having falsified and distorted the evidence presented in defense of the Cologne communists. In The Night of the Noble Consciousness, Marx denied that he had used unseemly tactics or committed indiscretions against his fellow communists. He underlined the essential difference between the Working Men's Educational Association and the Communist League, contrasting the, quote, public, exoteric, end quote, functioning of the first with the secret nature of the League, and explained in detail the issues which had led to a split between the group around Marx and Engels and the sectarian, quote, party of adventurers, end quote, under the leadership of Willich and Schopper. This 16-page pamphlet appeared in New York in mid-January. Marx continued his bi-weekly contributions to the Daily Tribune, for which he received £1 per article in payment. He was at variance with the Tribune's editors, who allowed, quote, only rubbish, end quote, to appear under his name, while the best of his articles were used as leaders without any mention of his authorship. See Letters to Engels, April 22nd. In the course of the year, Marx and Dana reached an agreement whereby Marx's articles were to appear henceforth as the anonymous contributions, quote, from our London correspondent, end quote. The chief preoccupation of the year's Tribune reports was the war between Russia and Turkey and its repercussions in the West. Marx hoped for a massive proletarian uprising to be ignited by the European war on the Eastern problem, and foresaw this revolution as the, quote, sixth and greatest European power, end quote, which would intimidate the other five. February 2nd, 1845. He criticized the European statesmen and politicians for their failures to provide an effective policy to check the Russian advances. He pilloried, for example, a Liberal member of the British Parliament, Richard Cobden, for sympathizing with the Tsar's foreign policy. February 16, 1854. Cobden was the author of numerous pamphlets in support of Tsarism. The French commander-in-chief of the Crimean troops, A. Leroy de Saint-Arnaud, also provoked Marx to a sharp critique, which presented the French officer as an unscrupulous adventurer and the prototype of Louis Bonaparte's party of power-mongers. June 24, 1854. Similarly, Marx attacked the war policies of the Prussians and the Austrians, terming Austria a tool in the hands of the Russian monarch and his English allies, while Prussia was characterized as, quote, greedy, vacillating, and pusillanimous, end quote, ready to support whatever party offered it the greatest advantages, regardless of its principles. That's on February 2nd, 1854. 2 articles in the Daily Tribune were devoted to the secret diplomatic correspondence between Britain and the other great powers for a division of conquered Turkey. Apart from this war in the first half of the year, Marx also treated British finances, electoral laws, and the general politico-economic situation, as well as the insurrection in Greece and the Allied occupation. In early February, E. Tucker prepared, with Marx's aid, a revised edition of the first political fly sheet under the new title, Palmerston in Poland. At the same time, Tucker brought out a second Palmerston fly sheet entitled Palmerston, What Has He Done? Or Palmerston in the Treaty of Unkiar Skelessi, and containing 2 more of the 6 People's Paper articles. Noting that there was, quote, a pretty brisk demand, end quote, for these 2 publications, Tucker suggested to Marx a third. See Marx and Engels, July 27, 1854. In February, the first meeting took place between Marx and the, quote, thoroughgoing monomaniac, end quote, Russophobe David Urquhart in London. The latter paid Marx the high compliment of saying that his anti-Palmerston articles left the same impression, quote, as if a Turk had written them, end quote. Marx retorted that his orientation was rather more revolutionary than Turkophile. Marx to Engels, February 9, 1854. The predominant topic of discussion in Marx's correspondence with Ferdinand Lassalle was also the Crimean War. Lassalle, who had access to the highest official sources of information on the war in Prussia, furnished Marx with material for a Tribune article on, quote, the mission of Count Orloff, end quote, February 20th to 21st, 1854. The 2 men differed on the question of Palmerston and his true intentions and on a definition of the nature of this war. Lassalle maintained that England had no plan for waging a, quote, phony war, end quote, but that, on the contrary, the British ministry feared that the war would become, quote, gruesomely serious, end quote. March 7th, 1854. Lassalle attempted to correct Marx's image of Palmerston who, whatever might be the result of his politics, was not deliberately acting in the interests of the Tsar. Marx replied that for him, nothing was more certain than the conclusion that, quote, Palmerston is a Russian agent, end quote. April 6, 1854. They did agree, however, that, quote, the present apathy cannot be overcome by theory, end quote, but only through the heat of an open conflict. Lassalle to Marx, February 10, 1854, that a German revolution would result from an all-out war against Russia. In March, the Chartists called together a, quote, labor parliament, end quote, and invited Marx to attend as an honorary delegate. Marx declined the invitation but sent a message of congratulations to the Assembly, which was published subsequently in the People's Paper, March 18, 1854, quote, the mere assembling of such a parliament marks a new epoch in the history of the world, end quote, and was certain to arouse the hopes of the working class in Europe and America that it would soon be possible to free their productive powers from the, quote, infamous shackles of monopoly, end quote, and subject them to the joint control of their producers. Having conquered nature, the working classes now had the task of conquering man, and the most effective step towards this goal, Marx concluded, would be a national organization of their forces modeled on the labor parliament. Marx Engels, On Britain, page 403. Wilhelm Weitling's German newspaper, Die Republik der Arbeiter, published in New York, brought out a series of articles on, quote, the fundamental trends of the times, end quote, among them a critique of Marx's economic thought, which Marx referred to as a, quote, furious onslaught on our, quote, corrupt ideas, end quote, and unprincipled, quote, frivolity, end quote, end quote. Letter to Engels, May 5th, 1854. The author, E. Wyss, compared Marx and his adherents to the Neptunists, who maintained that the earth was formed by the striking of the waters, with the difference that the former steadfastly persist in their belief that the, quote, development of class contradictions, end quote, and the effects thereof, alternating periods of crisis and prosperity, are the moving factors. Quote, they calculate that a new society will be constituted when the revolution with its primary impulses is at work among the peoples, when volcanic man finally rises up on this volcanic earth to break through the petrified products of his past, to melt down and destroy its tyrannic insolence and oppressive strata of class contradictions with subterranean fire, end quote. Die Republik der Arbeiter, April 1st, 1854. The Marx family's financial circumstances continued to be dismal. They were frequently ill, yet lacked the money for medicine and doctor's fees. In May, the children came down with measles, while Marx was suffering from a facial ulcer, which hindered his work. In June, Jenny Marx was pregnant, and when she became seriously ill, Marx was unable to call the doctor, to whom he owed a total of 26 pounds. He wrote to Engels for assistance and remarked, quote, "Beatus ill, who has no family," end quote. June 21st, 1854. I don't know what that means. Lucky is he who has no family, perhaps? I don't know. June 21st, 1854. The Marx family's financial circumstances continued to be dismal. They were frequently ill. Where am I? Sorry, I started repeating myself. Marx's reading for the year was oriented around the themes he treated for the Tribune. In March, he took up a history of the Ottoman Empire by Joseph Hammer Purgstall. He began learning Spanish with the intention of studying the current events and history of Spain, and before long was reading Don Quixote in the original, Calderon, etc. A work which he found most interesting was Augustin Thierry's Essai sur l'histoire de la formation et des progrès du tiers-état, published in 1853. Quote, "Father of the class struggle," end quote, in French historical writing. Thierry expressed in his preface a certain indignation with writers who tried to discover class antagonisms between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and to find the roots of this conflict in the history of the tiers-état before 1789. Quote, "If M. Thierry has read us," end quote, Marx wrote to Engels, quote, "he would have known that the decisive antagonism between bourgeoisie and peuple, or I don't know how to say that, French people, French word for people, does not arise, of course, until the former has ceased its opposition to the clergé and the noblesse as the tiers état, end quote. Marx. July 27th, 1854. Characteristic of France. Marx noted in reading theory was that the bourgeoisie had traditionally gained strength through parliamentary representation in the bureaucracy, and not, as in England, exclusively through commerce and industry. After doing intensive research in Spanish history with works by Carlos Luis Federico de Bransen, H. Wood, Chateaubriand, and Manuel de Mariani, Marx wrote 9 articles for the Tribune, which were published under the heading, quote, Revolutionary Spain, end quote, from September to December. At the same time, he continued to send the Tribune regular reports of the actual course of the 1854 revolution, which began in summer. Thus, taken together, Marx's series of articles on Spain provide at once a historical analysis of the circumstances which made the country ripe for revolution and a descriptive account of the most recent outbreak. In the first article on, quote, Revolutionary Spain, September 25, 1854, Marx explained the unique character of Spain's feudal monarchy, which he compared to Asiatic forms of government. Although headed by an absolutist sovereign, the, quote, agglomeration of mismanaged republics, end quote, called Spain did not become centralized, and the local independence nourished popular civil liberties. Marx, Engels, Revolution in Spain, page 26. This, quote, Oriental, end quote, system of despotism tolerated self-government, and since labor was not repartitioned on a national scale, nor is there extensive internal exchange of goods, the transition to centralization was checked. Marx devoted the third article to an analysis of the 1808 war for Spanish independence against the Napoleonic forces, October 20th, 1854. This great popular movement was both nationalist in opposing the French aggressors and dynastic, reactionary, superstitious, and fanatical. Quote, regeneration mixed up with reaction, end quote. For the defenders of Spanish sovereignty, the past offered a powerful source of resistance against French encroachments, and the country's, quote, Oriental, end quote, peculiarities prevented the invaders from localizing their attacks. Quote, the center of Spanish resistance was nowhere and everywhere, end quote. In the provinces, juntas were successfully established, but the weak central junta failed in its revolutionary mission and permitted the old monarchic order to be restored. The people, however, retained their eagerness for regional insurrection and came to support the military in 1820, when the 1812 Constitution was reintroduced under Riego. In the current revolutionary endeavor, the military again played the role of the avant-garde, supported by a broad popular movement. However, this was no social revolution which Spain was experiencing. Marx pointed out, for, quote, the social question in the modern sense of the word has no foundation in a country with its resources yet undeveloped, and with such a scanty population as Spain, end quote. The country's sole national institution was its army, which therefore symbolized for the people the, quote, state, end quote. Consequently, quote, the movable part of the nation has been accustomed to regard the army as the national instrument of every national rising, end quote. Just as the point when the revolution seemed likely to succeed, the vivid Spanish imagination made of General Espartero a great national hero, whose reputed greatness, however, had no logical connection with the facts. With his return to power, the counter-revolution began. Marx observed, quote, it is one of the peculiarities of revolutions that just as a people seem about to take a great start and open a new era, they suffer themselves to be ruled by the delusions of the past and surrender all the powers and influence they have so dearly won into the hands of men who represent, or are supposed to represent, the popular movement of a bygone epoch, end quote. August 19th, 1854. In October, in connection with his studies on Spain, Marx read Chateaubriand's Congrès de Verona from 1838, which was written in a style he described as a most repulsive mixture of, quote, elegant skepticism and Voltaireanism of the 18th century and fashionable 19th century sentimentalism and romanticism, end quote. Letter to Engels, October 26, 1854. The, quote, conceited dandy, end quote, Chateaubriand openly admitted in his book to having been personally responsible for the French aggression against Spain in 1822. As the fighting in the East continued, Marx reviewed the issues, covert and professed, which motivated this prolonged struggle. Under the guise of religious protectionism, rival bourgeois and aristocratic powers were exploiting nationalist movements for their own expansionist aims. Under the pretext of sacredness, the Crimean conflict was as much racial as national and represented a, quote, democratic revolt against ecclesiastical authority, end quote, which authority still retained a strong hold over the state and population in Tsarist Russia. Quote, Russia is claimed for its war of might against right, a religious sanction as a war of the vice-regent of God against the infidel Turks, end quote. Nonetheless, this revolt marked a trend whose ultimate development was undeniably, quote, toward abrogating absolute authority and establishing the independence of the individual judgment and conscience in the religious as well as the political sphere of life, end quote. The proletarian revolution, however, which Marx had hoped for at the outset of this conflict, failed to take place, and, related to this failure, Europe proved incapable of conducting a real war, quote, a decent, hearty, hard-fought war, end quote, as Marx imagined it, which would bring the Eastern question to a decisive climax, August 17, 1854. Reading Roswell Ripley's History of the War with Mexico, published in 1849, Marx was particularly struck by the figure of General Scott, reputedly America's first general, but according to Ripley, a most, quote, vulgar, petty, untalented, whining, jealous bastard and a humbug who, while conscious of owning everything to the bravery of his soldiers and the skill of his division, plays low-down tricks in order to assure himself of glory, end quote. Marx, Letter to Engels, December 2nd, 1854. LaSalle invited Marx to become a London correspondent for the Breslau Neue Oder Zeitung, whose ownership had just been assumed by LaSalle's cousin. On December 20th, Marx accepted this offer in a letter to the editor, Moritz Elsner. New section, 1855. With the new year, Marx began his work for the Neue Oder Zeitung, which published roughly 100 of Marx's reports during the next 12 months, along with a substantial number by Engels. Marx's contributions to the Daily Tribune numbered only 10, and it was Engels who wrote more frequently for New York this year, 1855. Marx reported for the Neue Oder Zeitung on international issues as well as on British politics and current events. His first article was a retrospective on recent world political affairs. He remarked that the British declaration of war against Russia was evidence of the weight of the popular masses on Parliament's decisions and signaled the end of bourgeois political domination. January 2nd, 1854. In January, Marx wrote several articles on the latest developments in the Crimean War, in particular on the, quote, 4 points, and also commented on British trade and the present commercial crisis. On January 16th, Eleanor Marx was born. Into bleak London weather and equally dismal material circumstances, Marx feared the worst for their youngest, quote, bona fide traveler, end quote. He wrote Engels on February 13th, 1854, where she soon became seriously ill. Rereading his excerpt notebooks on, quote, economics, he wanted to, quote, master their contents and have the essentials ready for the moment when he would actually begin writing. Letter to Engels, February 13th, 1855. Did I say the wrong date earlier? Anyway. Eleanor Marx, born 1855. Marx overstrained his eyes and caught an inflammation. Thanks to his wealth of notes and excerpts, Marx was able to provide Engels with a detailed account of the parliamentary proceedings under the Aberdeen government from 1852 to 1855 and the machinations between government and business for the same period. Engels' article, entitled The Last British Government, appeared as a leader in the Daily Tribune on February 23rd. Marx also furnished Lassalle with figures on the importation of grain to England since the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. He hazarded the conclusion that, while the price relations of industrial products had not been affected by the change in importation laws, the relative value of wages in agriculture had dropped in respect to the landowner's profit. This was a necessary consequence of the development of capital, as Marx elaborated in his 1847 pamphlet on the free trade problem. He promised Lassalle statistical material from his notebooks in support of this hypothesis, adding that other works on this topic would undoubtedly appear soon since, quote, the period of crisis in England is simultaneously that of theoretical investigations, end quote. Marx, January 23, 1855. Apart from research necessary for his current journalism, Marx did little reading of a personal nature. In a letter to Engels on the 8th of March, he recounted having studied Roman history at the beginning of the year and drew the following conclusion from his investigations. Quote, the internal history of Rome may plainly be resolved into the struggle between small and large landowners, modified naturally by the circumstances specific to slavery, the relations caused by debts, which from the start of Roman history played such an important role, figuring now only in a family sense for small property holdings, end quote. Marx, March 8, 1855. Marx declined an invitation of the International Emigrant Committee to attend a banquet on the anniversary of the February Revolution and to become an active member of their organization. His reasons, he explained to Engels, were threefold. First of all, he considered such gatherings to be pointless. He did not want to attract the attention of the British police unnecessarily, and finally he wished to avoid meeting Alexander Herzen, having no desire to, quote, see old Europe renewed with Russian blood, end quote, an opinion he later repeated in the first edition of Capital. February 13th, 1855. Marx reported in February and March for the Neue Oder Zeitung, chiefly on British affairs, on the parliamentary situation in Lord Palmerston, on the military, using information supplied by Engels, on Ireland's misery and growing unrest. He also wrote 2 articles on the reaction of the British press to the death of the Russian Tsar, typical of Marx's invectives against the British upper class, were his remarks on Lord Palmerston, a man who, quote, with unconscionable adroitness, has duped and cheated both friend and foe, end quote. Neue Oder Zeitung, March 3rd. He also exposed the corruption in governmental and military affairs, where nepotism and bribery had become, quote, the 2 factors that count, end quote, just as in the church. Corruption was facilitated, Marx wrote, by the British Constitution, a document which he had analyzed in the Tribune on March 24th. This constitution amounted to no more than a, quote, superannuated compromise by which the general governing power is abandoned to some sections of the middle class, on condition that the whole of the real government, is secured to the landed aristocracy, end quote. Marx and Engels on Britain. Through the war, however, and the commercial crisis which came in its wake, the bankruptcy and helplessness of the old system had become evident. Marx predicted that the climax would soon be reached, and then, quote, will the mask be torn off which has hitherto hid the real political features of Great Britain, end quote. The crass, C-R-A-S-S, antagonisms between proletariat and bourgeoisie would be openly recognized, and England, quote, compelled to share in the general social evolutions of European society, end quote. 1 second. Early in March, Marx's 8-year-old son, Edgar, quote, Mush, was taken ill with a dangerous gastric fever. Marx was himself suffering from frequent coughing spells, and the doctor recommended that the family leave the unhealthy district of Soho where they were living. This was, of course, not financially feasible for the Marxists, who could scarcely make ends meet, even with Engels' occasional contributions to their budget. Marx tended his son through weeks of critical illness, yet his condition worsened. The concerned father wrote to his friend Engels, quote, my wife has been ill for a week now as never before because of mental agitation. My own heart is bleeding and my head is on fire, although of course I must maintain my composure. Not for a moment during this illness has the child betrayed his usual nature, at once original, good-natured, and self-reliant, end quote. Marx, March 30th, 1855. On April 6, 1855, little Mush, quote, animating spirit, end quote, of the Marx household, died in his father's arms. For Marx and his wife, the house seemed suddenly deserted and desolated. Both were completely, quote, downbroken, end quote. Only one thought consoled him. Marx wrote to his friend, quote, Amidst all the terrible moments of anguish which I have gone through in these past days, the thought of you and your friendship has kept me going in the hope that together we still have an intelligent task to accomplish in this world." End quote. Marx, April 12, 1855. On April 18, 1855, Marx and his wife traveled to Manchester, where they spent 2 weeks with Engels. Jenny continued to suffer physically and mentally from her bereavement, and Marx, too, admitted to Lassalle how much he felt the loss of their son. Quote, "Bacon said that really important men have so many relations to the world and to nature, so many objects of interest, that they can easily get over every loss. I do not belong to their number. My child's death has deeply affected me, both mentally and emotionally, and I still feel the loss as acutely as on the first day. My poor wife is completely downbroken as well." End quote. July 28, 1854. Upon Marx's recommendation, Engels undertook to write 2 articles on the Pan-Slavic movement, which were published subsequently in both the Neue Oder Zeitung and the Daily Tribune, April to May 1855. Marx transmitted them to Elsner of the Neue Oder Zeitung, remarking that they were intended as part of a series and stressing the importance of informing Germany, quote, "of the danger which is threatening," end quote. April 17, 1855. The Daily Tribune made certain changes in Engels' text which distorted his views in conformity with the pan-Slavism of one of the editors. Engels' own attitude was most decidedly anti-pan-Slavic. Engels described this movement as the drive to liberate the Slav peoples under foreign domination, combined with a political action whose aim was the destruction of Western culture. Quote, "It leaves Europe in only one alternative: submission to the Slavic yoke or destruction forever of its offensive strength, Russia." End quote. April 21st, 1855. Although it had its origins in Austria as the offspring of the Slavic philologists who attempted to extract from linguistic similarities a doctrine of Slavic unity, Pan-Slavism had not found its driving force until it was espoused by Russia, which turned it into a threat for all Europe. From May to July, Marx's articles in Neue Oder Zeitung centered principally around political and economic affairs in England. He wrote on the debates in Parliament, where the bureaucracy created, quote, "an inexhaustible arsenal of parliamentary chicanery, hair-splitting and tactic maneuvering," end quote. On the occasion for administrative reform, on the Chartists, who exposed both the war in the East and the reform proposals, Marx reviewed the various Chartist demands, beginning with the universal suffrage, which would assure the popular masses of political power, quote, "as a means towards the realization of their social needs," end quote. Neue Oder Zeitung, June 8, 1855. The Chartists and thousands of other protesting British citizens assembled in Hyde Park on June 24th and July 1st to demonstrate against the passage of a beer bill and a Sunday trading bill, measures which prohibited small shopkeepers from staying open on Sundays and closed the public amusement centers for the greater part of the day. Marx, who also attended and reported on these demonstrations for the Neue Oder Zeitung, saw these laws as attempts by the Church to reestablish and consolidate its power over the masses with compulsory measures that, in fact, foster the interests of the beer magnates and large commercial enterprises. The arbitrariness of these measures prompted Marx to compare England with medieval France. Quote, "In the 15th century, the French aristocracy said, 'Voltaire for us, the mass and the tithes for the people.' In the 19th century, the English aristocracy says, 'Pious phrases for us, Christian practice for the people,'" end quote. Marx, June 28, 1855. The scenes he witnessed in Hyde Park provided Marx with ample evidence that the struggle against clericalism had assumed the proportions of a battle between rich and poor, and convinced him, moreover, quote, "that yesterday in Hyde Park the English Revolution began." That yesterday in Hyde Park the English Revolution began, end quote. In May 1855, E. Tucker published in book form 3 of Marx's Palmerston articles mentioning the author by name in his preface. Marx feared that political repercussions might follow which would endanger his precarious situation as an alien in England. The, quote, "incomprehensible war," end quote, against Russia continued, and Marx furnished the Neue Oder Zeitung with numerous reports, dealing in particular with the military affairs of British and French. In the Neue Oder Zeitung, on August 31st, he drew attention to the frequent desertions from the British army stationed outside Sebastopol. The reason for these desertions was to be found in the traditional British method of keeping discipline within the ranks, namely flogging. While the other European armies had begun to abolish corporal punishment, in England, quote, "the cat o' nine tails has been conserved in all its efficiency as an instrument of torture equal in rank to the Russian harrow," end quote. In reality, flogging destroyed discipline instead of maintaining it by breaking the soldier's morale and his point d'honneur. Translated in social terms, this military practice was but another means of retaining the aristocratic nature of British institutions. Earlier in the year, Lord John Russell, colonial minister and president of the Privy Council, resigned his office in face of the growing crisis in the Crimea. Marx commented on the parliamentary happenings and devoted a special series of 6 articles to Russell and his parliamentary and ministerial career. The articles were published in the Neue Oder Zeitung from July 28th to August 25th, 1855, in the Daily Tribune on August 28th, a, quote, classic representative of modern Whiggism, end quote. Russell was incapable of transforming his opinions and views into deeds. Whatever the issue might be, Jewish emancipation, anti-clericalism, law reform, free trade, or the Irish emancipation, Russell failed each time to realize the standpoint he had taken. His true genius, Marx noted, lay in his ability to reduce these generous political measures to trivial parliamentary bills or to dissolve them magically before they became law. His career and his reputation were built on false pretenses, began under the pretense of tolerance and liberalism, and ended on a note of bigotry. Quote, placed by birth, connections and social accident on a colossal pedestal, he always remained the same homunculus, a malignant and distorted dwarf on the top of a pyramid. The history of the world exhibits, perhaps, no other man so great in littleness, end quote. August 28, 1855. In a letter to Elsner on September 11th, Marx declared that in view of the present financial crisis of the Neue Oder Zeitung, he would be willing to continue his reports even without payment. He valued highly the fact that, quote, the Neue Oder Zeitung published the extreme limit of what can possibly be published under the present press circumstances, end quote, in Germany. To Elsner, November 8, 1855. Although this offer might suggest otherwise, Marx's financial circumstances had not improved. On the contrary, Marx was obliged to hide out with Engels in Manchester from September 12th to December 4th to avoid a legal action for non-payment of medical bills. In October, having mistakenly assumed that Elsner had abandoned the paper to a group of Breslau liberals, Marx interrupted his bi-weekly reports. In November, he resumed reporting for the Daily Tribune as well and came to an agreement with Dana, D-A-N-A, whereby he would be paid $10 per article for bi-weekly contributions. All of his Tribune articles now appeared anonymously. The year's last pieces of journalism dealt with the Crimean War, speculation on the European markets, and British politics. New section, 1856. During the winter 1855-56, Marx had several visits with his estranged friend Bruno Bauer, who was spending some time in England. Marx described Bauer as a light-hearted old gentleman, a confirmed bachelor as always, and hazarded the guess that Bauer wanted to introduce, quote, scientific theology, end quote, now dead in Germany, in England. In his letters to Engels, Marx recounted the conversations he had with Bauer, who held class struggles to be illusory, and told Marx that the proletariat had no hatred for the other classes. A few pennies more in wages and everything would be in order. See letter to Engels, January 18th and February 12th, 1856. This year, Marx contributed roughly 24 articles to the Daily Tribune and 7 to the Chartist People's Paper. The London Free Press reprinted, between 1855 and February of this year, the 1853 series on Lord Palmerston. British affairs were the chief topic of Marx's writing for the Daily Tribune, along with the Crimean War. However, as he wrote to Engels on February 12th, quote, this newspaper writing is getting to be most bothersome now, since nothing at all is going on in England, and the change in the economic situation is not very clear yet. At the moment, the decisive factor is the swindling on the stock markets, but for this the necessary material is lacking, end quote. Early in February 1856, Marx began investigating a number of documents on British diplomatic relations which he had discovered accidentally in the British Museum Library. He then decided to use his findings for a detailed study of the secret collaboration between St. Petersburg and London, which helped Russia to its place as a world power. Marx was particularly interested in finding a publisher for his, quote, Curiosa, end quote, which would expose Britain's complicity with Russia and the conscious submission of British statesmen to the will of the Eastern despots. In one of his first articles for the Daily Tribune this year, Marx anticipated the viewpoint sketched above. Reporting on, quote, traditional English policy, end quote, Marx stated that historical evidence did not corroborate Britain's professed opposition to Russian expansionism, but that, on the contrary, British diplomats had always behaved as Russia's lackeys. Marx recounted the example of the statesman Sir James Harris, who, during the American War of Independence, convinced his government of the, quote, necessity of nourishing the Russian appetite, if her aid against the American colonies was to be secured, end quote. Marx queried the logic behind such an act. Quote, was Russia less barbarous than she is pictured now? Was she less than that hideous despotism? Was she less than that hideous despotism which modern Whigs in such terrible color portray her? End quote. New York Daily Tribune, January 12, 1856. Marx could only denounce the course chosen by the British as a betrayal of their own interest in Europe. Marx reported on the approaching conclusion to the long war in the Crimea in an article titled, quote, The Results of the War, end quote, from February 16, 1856. Despite its cost, in terms of men and materials, this war had shaken neither the political nor the social state of Europe. Quote, the squandering of these immense resources and the sacrifice of torrents of blood have gained nothing for the people, end quote. Marx's commentary on the Treaty of Paris, dated March 30th, appeared in the Daily Tribune on April 14th. He attached far greater significance to this treaty than to the Treaty of 1840-41, insofar as it signaled the end of the Holy Alliance and pointed to new, quote, affinities and detractions, end quote, between countries, notably France and Russia. The war itself, Marx termed, quote, exclusively diplomatic, end quote, and like most other European wars, it had been conducted, quote, by princes for their individual aims and interests. Of course, the various classes of people and nations have not been contemplated and received no real satisfaction, end quote, from the struggle. During the first part of the year, Marx began an intensive study of Slavic history, literature, and culture. Again, he inspired Engels to write a series of articles on Pan-Slavism for the Daily Tribune. And corresponding with Engels, Marx provided him with an abundance of bibliographical material, and much critical commentary on the works in question. Marx sent the finished manuscripts to Charles Dana, who returned them, however, in September 1856, unpublished. Marx later learned that Dana had been influenced by a member of the Tribune's editorial staff who was in the service of the Russian government. Although the articles never appeared in print, quote, we have the honor, end quote, Marx wrote to Engels, quote, of having had, our articles inspected and censored by the Russian legation, end quote. October 1856. So October 30th, 1856. For the Daily Tribune, and both the People's Paper and the Free Press in London, Marx prepared a critique of the British defeat at Kars when this Turkish city fell into the hands of the Russians on November 28, 1855. Supporting his argumentation with official documents and statements of the participants in the struggle, Marx claimed that the British government deliberately foiled the military defense of Kars by falsifying communiques and suppressing important papers. A, quote, phony war, end quote, had been fought. A, quote, phony peace, end quote, which concluded, and the heroes of the British army and diplomacy could collect their rewards. Quote, history exhibits, perhaps, no parallel more bitterly ludicrous than that between the British government making England the laughingstock of Europe by its adventures in the Crimea, the Baltic, and the Pacific, and the rewards lavished on the tools of its miscarriages, ... End quote. People's Paper, April 26, 1856. A series of 4 articles on the quote, fall of Kars, end quote, appeared in the People's Paper, April 1856, one in the Tribune, April 18, 1856, and one entitled Kars Papers Curiosities in the Free Press, May 3, 1856. Marx was the only member of the London emigration to be invited to a celebration on April 14, 1856, for the 4th anniversary of the People's Paper. He delivered a short address in which he spoke of the social revolution which had been foreshadowed by the revolutions of 1848-49. Characterizing the 19th century as a time in which, quote, everything seems pregnant with its contrary, end quote, Marx summed up the antagonism between modern industry and scientific progress on the one hand and social relations on the other. Quote, at the same pace that mankind masters nature, man seems to become enslaved to other men or to his own infamy, end quote. Amidst the signs of dissolution and progress, quote, signs that bewilder the middle class, the aristocracy, and the poor prophets of aggression, end quote, Marx saw an element of potential social upheaval in the, quote, newfangled men, end quote, of modern industrial society. These pioneers of the English working class at their fore would aid, quote, our brave friend Robin Goodfellow, the old mole that can work in the earth so fast, that worthy pioneer, the revolution, end quote, to emancipate the world from the domination of capital and wage slavery. Occasional articles were devoted in this year, 1856, to the developments in Prussia or Italy. A new upsurge of constitutionalism in Italy provided the motive for an article in the House of Savoy, ruler of Sardinia and of Piedmont, May 1856. Bourgeoisie and peasant and proletarian masses had begun cooperating in Italy in order to check the power of what Marx referred to as the, quote, Piedmontese nightmare, end quote. By contrast, Prussia did not seem to be making progress towards constitutional democracy, and Marx could only discern signs of dissension and disaccord among elements of society. New York Daily Tribune, May 5, 1856. In May 1856, Engels, while traveling throughout Ireland, observed the people and their living conditions. He wrote to Marx about the tangible reality of Ireland, famine and devastation. Ireland was indeed England's, quote, first colony, end quote. Quote, how often have the Irish set out to achieve something, and every time they have been crushed down, politically and industrially. Through consistent oppression, they have been artificially made into a racked and ruined nation, ... end quote, Engels. May 23, 1856. Marx's well-documented study of the 18th century diplomatic affairs between Russia and England, which he had been preparing since the beginning of the years, was published in abridged form in the Sheffield Free Press, June to August 1856. After Marx had objected to unauthorized changes, the full text of the Revelations of the Diplomatic History of the 18th Century was later printed in the London Free Press, August 1856 to April 1857. The 7 documents which Marx revealed in his secret diplomatic history exposed the expansionist plans of the Russian Tsar and the deliberate, intentional aid which the British diplomats granted him, while damaging their own national interest, both political and financial. In the secret dispatches which Marx discovered and published, the British statesmen are found conversing about, quote, Russia and her rulers in a tone of awful reserve, abject servility, and cynical submission, end quote. Secret diplomatic history of the 18th, my brain just farted. In the secret dispatches, which Marx discovered and published, the British statesmen are found conversing about, quote, Russia and her rulers in a tone of awful reserve, abject servility, and cynical submission, end quote. Secret diplomatic history, page 91. Despite many warnings at home about the Russian plans for world domination, the British diplomats persisted in fawning for, quote, a strong glow of friendship, end quote, from the Russian Empress Anne, without, for their part, receiving even the slightest promise of material advantage. Claims that British trade had expanded during the reign of Peter the Great, who was supported by London, were greatly exaggerated. Neither navigation nor commerce in general profited from the opening of trade relations with Russia at the expense of the trade with Sweden. Thus, quote, there devolved on the cabinet, at least, the onus of inventing mercantile pretexts, however futile, for the measures of foreign policy, end quote. Beginning in the 14th century, an immense empire emerged in the, quote, historical arena, end quote, under the reigns of Ivan I, Kalita, 1328-40, and of Ivan III, surnamed the Great, 1448-1505. Ivan Kalita, Marx recounted, overthrew the Tartar yoke with the, quote, Machiavellianism of the usurping slave. His own weakness, his slavery, he turned into the mainspring of his strength, end quote. Ivan I's policies endured under his successors, and as Marx stated in a section of the history which was omitted in the first printing, quote, a simple substitution of names and dates will prove to evidence that between the policy of Ivan III and that of modern Russia, there exists no similarity but sameness, end quote. Peter the Great in the 17th and 18th centuries merited recognition for a successful transformation of the traditional Muscovite methods of local expansion into methods worthy of a country aspiring to unlimited power. Peter the Great took hold of the Baltic provinces and made Petersburg, quote, the eccentric center of the empire, end quote, and Peter the Great's own, quote, abode of cosmopolitan intrigue, end quote. From here, was able to win from Europe the necessary elements of culture, military cunning, bureaucrats and teachers, quote, who were to drill Russians into that varnish of civilization that adapts them to the technical appliances of the Western peoples without imbuing them with their ideas, end quote. Tsar Peter thus succeeded in coupling, quote, the political craft of the Mongol slave with the proud aspiration of the Mongol master, to whom Genghis Khan had, by will, bequeathed his conquest of the earth, end quote. Marx's commentaries, published in the summer of the year, on the Spanish Revolution and the founding of the French bank Crédit Mobilier, are of particular interest as historical analyses which surpass the scope of ordinary reporting. In Marx's words, the recent Spanish insurrection illustrated anew, quote, the character of most of the European struggles of 1848 to 49 and of those thereafter to take place on the western portion of that continent, end quote. Marx and Engels on Spain. The struggle began typically with the battle lines drawn between the middle classes, supported by industry and the powers of the military and the royal court. The alignment of forces broke down, however, as soon as the working class joined the rebellious bourgeoisie against the despotic rulers. As in the earlier revolutions, the middle class, frightened by the prospects of social upheaval, sought the protection of the detested military. This, Marx maintained, was the, quote, secret of the standing armies of Europe, which otherwise will be incomprehensible to the future historian, end quote. The bourgeoisie was thus forced to choose between renouncing all political power to the despots or renouncing its own monopoly on social power to the advantage of the working class. August 8, 1856. In June 1856, Marx embarked on a long and detailed analysis of the crisis of speculation which had gripped Europe. Marx began with 3 articles in the Daily Tribune on the French joint stock bank, Crédit Mobilier. This project began in 1852 when Louis Bonaparte discovered a means to convert, quote, all the property and all the industry of France into a personal obligation toward Louis Bonaparte, end quote. He was aided in this enterprise by the ex-followers of Saint-Simon, whose belief was that class differences would disappear, quote, before the creation of universal wealth by some newfangled scheme of public wealth, end quote. June 24th. Bonaparte had the luck to find 2 such former Saint-Simonians, the brothers Perrier, quote, spacing out. Louis Bonaparte was aided in this enterprise by the experience of Saint-Simon. His belief was that class differences would disappear, quote, before the creation of universal wealth by some newfangled scheme of public wealth, end quote. June 24th, 1856. Bonaparte had the luck to find 2 such Saint-Simonians, the brothers Perrier, quote, who with their practical experience had the boldness to suspect stock jobbing behind socialism, law behind Saint-Simon, end quote, and became the initiators of, quote, Bonapartist socialism, end quote, and the founders of Crédit Mobilier. These banks engaged in activities similar to modern holding companies and realized their greatest revenues by speculating on the stock market. Marx foresaw the onbreak of a new era in political economy thanks to such companies, for they, quote, revealed the productive powers of association not suspected before, and called into life industrial creations on a scale unattainable by the efforts of individual capitalists. On the other hand, it must not be forgotten that in joint stock companies it is not the individuals that are associated but the capital, ... The concentration of capital has been accelerated, and as a natural corollary, the downfall of the small middle class, end quote. Marx, July 11th, 1856. In a related article published in October 1856 and devoted to the, quote, monetary crisis in Europe, end quote, Marx endeavored to trace the significance of socioeconomic development since the 1848 uprisings. This period had been one of respite, which permitted capitalist society, quote, a last condensed display of all its tendencies, in politics, adoration of the sword, in morals, general corruption and hypocritical return to explained superstitions. In political economy, the mania of getting rich without the pains of producing, end quote. Marx, New York Daily Tribune, October 15th, 1856. Aided by inheritance from Jenny Marx's deceased relatives, the family was able to move into more spacious living quarters in the healthier district of London near Maitland Park, September 1856. At this time, Marx again took up his excerpt notebooks in connection with his New York Daily Tribune articles on economic problems and prepared a collection of quotations on monetary theory. He also studied Polish history, in particular the division of Poland since 1789. He read in French a book by Miroslavsky on the history of the Polish commune from the 10th to the 18th centuries. He became a decided partisan of Poland, noting the historic fact, quote, that the intensity and vitality of all revolutions since 1789 are to be measured with near certainty in direct relation to their attitude towards Poland, end quote. Marx to Engels, December 2nd, 1856. Poland, in other words, was their, quote, external thermometer, end quote. The current conflict between Prussia and Switzerland over the small principality of Neufchâtel inspired Marx to study Prussian history and the rise of the House of Hohenzollern. He learned that this great northern power had won its empire through, quote, small penny thievery, bribery, outright buys, manipulation with inheritances, etc., end quote. That all its activities were characterized by mediocrity and held upright with, quote, punctual accounting, avoidance of extremes, exactness in military drill, a certain pedestrian vulgarity, and, quote, church regulations, end quote, end quote. Marx wrote to Engels, quote, it's disgusting, end quote. December 2nd, 1856. That's the end of the chapter. Karl Marx, 1850 to 1856. Thanks for listening.